This mystery is unquestionably the most sensitive, controversial, and emotional enigma in the world today. The Shroud of Turin. Is it the burial cloth that covered Jesus Christ when his crucified body was laid in the tomb? And if it is not, then what is it?
The Shroud of Turin has ignited passionate debate across the centuries, with skeptics questioning its authenticity and pondering its origins. Can this linen cloth truly be the burial shroud of Jesus Christ, bearing the imprint of his image?
It is an absolute fact that the shroud is a painting, period. When I started working on it, I expected it to be real. I was hoping it would be real. I can't argue, however, with the microscope.
The radiocarbon dates that we obtained clearly put the shroud in the Middle Ages.
In recent years, renowned researcher Hugh Farey has emerged as a prominent skeptic, challenging prevailing beliefs with a compelling argument for the shroud's origins as a medieval forgery.
I've come to the conclusion that on balance, I think it's more likely to be a 14th century forgery. And I say that in spite of the fact that I'm a Catholic and teach at a Catholic school.
Join us as we embark on a journey into the mysteries of the Shroud of Turin. So why did you become interested in the shroud?
I would say I first became interested in the shroud in my secondary school because there was a book about it in the library. I should mention my secondary school was a monastic school. It was run by Benedictine monks, although the headmaster was a PhD in physics. So because I was, I've been a Catholic all my life. I'm still a Catholic, but the interrelationship between the Catholic faith, and indeed any faith, and science has always been integral to my, intellectual curiosity. And the shroud increasingly became a fascinating focus for that particular debate. I started about 1980, being vaguely interested in it. I joined the British Society for the Turin Shroud about the same time. But I retired 6 years ago, and since then I've worked on it more or less full time. Cradle Catholic, born a Catholic from Catholic parents, Catholic school, Catholic education, and I'd always taught in a Catholic school as well.
The pollen on this shroud, if you could just give me your thoughts on that, if those tests or studies were accurate.
Yeah. This was based on a scientist, a forensic scientist called Max Frei Samples, normally just known as Max Frei, who started the Zurich Swiss police forensic department and was one of the very first people to write a detailed paper on the use of sticky tape for picking up forensic traces from crime scenes. And he had the opportunity of going to Turin in 1969, I think, and then maybe 73, and taking samples off the Shroud of Turin by sticking bits of sticky tape onto it. And he then there we go. That's him actually doing the same thing again in 1978. However, having got your pollen grains, you then have to match them with something. You can't just look at a spiky piece of pollen and go, "Oh, I know what that is." You have to compare it with something, and this is extraordinarily difficult. Even now, for example, fingerprints. If you take somebody's fingerprints, however clear they are, the only way you can judge whose they are is by finding somebody else with similar fingerprints. Now, the good thing about fingerprints is that they're all absolutely unique. So you don't need to have very high-powered machinery. If you've got two fingerprints from the same person, you can see that they're the same. However, pollen falls into a whole bunch of fairly generic classes. There are sort of spherical lumps and football-shaped lumps and lumpy ones and spiky ones and so on. And at the time, in the 1970s, there was almost no pollen comparison charts to go around. And such as there were not very complete. So Max Frei went off to where he thought the pollen might have come from. In other words, Israel and Turkey, basically, and took lots of samples of pollen. Now, the trouble was that he only took pollen from those countries, so that when he looked at his microscope slide from the shroud and saw a spiky piece of pollen, he then found a spiky piece of pollen on one of his own samples and said, those two must be the same. Therefore, I've discovered a Turkish plant or an Israeli plant. What's more, because he knew the species of the samples that he'd taken, he assumed that the shroud pollen came from that particular species. Now, the trouble is that if you take a group of plants of a similar genus, they probably come from all over the world. And there may be 2 or 3 species which are indeed endemic to Israel or the Middle East. But the trouble is that any particular grain of pollen is no more like them than it is like other species of the same genus from anywhere else in the world. So my contention is that if he had gone, say, to Peru or Japan and collected a whole bunch of plants from there, he would have been able to match his shroud plants very accurately to Peru or Japan and announced the shroud must have come from South America. So his identification was almost immediately, very severely challenged by, I may say, a shroud enthusiast called Alan Wanger, who brought in 2 more palynologists who looked through Max Frei's pollen groupings and said, well, you can't be that precise about this one. You can't be that precise about this one. This one's too vague to be precise about at all. So ended up with a group of pollens which could have come from anywhere, really. And there was a very enthusiastic Israeli botanist who was so excited he thought he could see 20 or 30 different species of Israeli plant, sort of having made a kind of shadow on the shroud itself. And he thought, right, this is great. I've identified all these plants, which I think were just imperfections in the weave. You can make out all sorts of things if you look carefully enough. But he thought he could identify all these plants. And then he tried to match his identifications with Max Frei's pollen identifications, and they hardly match at all. And in the end, he decided that no geographical reliability could be placed on Max Frei's pollen identification. So, in other words, they don't tell you anything.
So, was he one of the first people to do samples on the shroud since it was before the Stirp team?
Oh, yes. There was an Italian. The Stirp team will tell you that they were the only scientific commission team that's ever studied the shroud. But no, there was an Italian team in 1970 who examined it in 1969 to see how fragile it was and whether they needed to do anything to maintain its integrity. And then in 1973, a full-scale scientific investigation involving, Max Frei's pollen samples and numerous little thread samples of a centimetre or so, which were extracted from all over the place so that the scientists could examine the threads. That's a big surprise to people.
From my understanding, Alan Wanger had some of the samples, but he passed away in 2017. So I was wondering, where are those samples today?
Well, I think he passed them on to an archaeologist called Paul Maloney, who was going to analyze them. But before he had a chance to, he passed away as well. And I'm not sure where they are now. I did write to Barry Schwartz at one point saying, why not bring them across to England? Because one of Britain's most leading palynologists was interested in doing a survey of them. But Barry said he didn't know where they were. They've disappeared. Well, they're in some, when somebody dies, their wife is probably quite old as well, and their children probably aren't terribly interested, and all their possessions get passed on in a big cardboard box. So they're there somewhere.
Are there other people around the world that have samples of the shroud still today?
Probably Barry Schwartz has got some left over from Ray Rogers, who kept bits and pieces. And the different Italian researchers have probably got some. And of course, the authorities in Turin have got masses. I mean, the Holland cloth, which was taken off the shroud for the restoration in 2002, and a lot of the little charred fragments from the burn holes and all that sort of thing. But they're all kept in Turin. So I think there's probably very little around elsewhere around the world. I think Giulio Fanti, who's an Italian scientist, he's had a few shreds of threads from Barry Schwartz, but and they're not things you can easily pick up.
I was watching an interview you gave, and you said that a lady, I think her name was Patricia Wiltshire,
Right.
messaged you.
Yes.
She's I guess an expert on the pollen, or actually did the test.
No, she had nothing to do with it. She was only interested. She was interested in the Shroud of Turin. She was well, she's retired now, but she was probably Britain's leading forensic palynologist until about 10 years ago, and was particularly famous for having solved some very difficult cases, criminal cases. So we corresponded a bit, and she expressed an interest in saying, well, if you want somebody impartial to have a look at these things, but who's now got all modern techniques at her disposal. But yes, unfortunately, the slides themselves seem to have gone to ground.
What do you think about the limestone on the shroud, that people found limestone on it?
People love to say that limestone's been found on various knees and the nose and the heels and things like that. Whereas it's quite easy to see by looking at the various maps made both at the time in 1978 and at other times where samples were taken from. None of the Sturp team took any samples from the nose. As far as I know, no sticky tape samples have been taken from the nose at all. So you can't say that there's limestone on the nose because no one's been able to see it. The only limestone that I know has been analysed was a tape from the heels, which is fair enough. That's where you'd expect bare feet to pick up limestone, but there could be limestone elsewhere. And it was analysed by, I have to say, probably the world's leading limestone analyst, a chap called Riccardo Levi Setti, and he compared the Shroud limestone to some samples that were collected in Jerusalem. And when they were examined spectrographically, in other words, showing how many, all the different elements that were present. And when these were published, various people said that the two spectra, the spectra of the Jerusalem limestone and the spectrum of the Shroud limestone, were extraordinarily similar. And everyone took that as read. There we go. This proves that there's Shroud limestone, that the Jerusalem limestone on the Shroud. As far as I know, I'm the only person who's actually analysed the spectra that the two of that were actually taken, and found that they're not similar at all. They're really quite different. And in fact, the Shroud limestone is more like limestone from some quarries in Paris than it is like anything in Jerusalem. Now, if I could just make that a bit clearer so that people can see what we mean by extraordinarily similar and completely different. I mean, you think, well, surely people should be able to tell the difference. I'm going to draw you a graph using, if I can, a felt tip that works. So if we look at two samples of limestone, we might find that we've got peaks like that, which show us the different elements that are found on the limestone. Is that clear enough? So if we get another sample of limestone, we might find peaks that are like this. Oh, I want a red one. Well, there we go. I love doing things live. Now, you can see straight away that all the peaks are in exactly the same place. That one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, and that one. And so it's possible to say, look, these two limestones are the same. But the fact is that all limestone from all over the world has got this particular set of elements in them to one extent or another. The question is whether the peaks are the same height. And the trouble is that they're not. My blue peaks are very different heights. Sometimes they coincide, but they're very different heights from my red peaks. And therefore, the elements are in different proportions. So, for example, we think of limestone as being very largely calcium carbonate, which it is all over the world. But it often has some magnesium carbonate as a small fraction of it. And the magnesium carbonate fraction of the Jerusalem limestone and the Shroud limestone is very different, showing that they cannot have come from the same geology. And that's the sort of thing which I've examined in immense detail on my blog.
Something I forgot to ask you about the pollen. I mean, this might be a dumb question, I don't know. But do pollen species, do they change over time or go extinct?
No, is the short answer. I mean, yeah, plants go extinct, and there is some difficulty with pollen from dinosaur times. But there's no, it's not possible to compare extinct pollen and find out what it is, because you haven't got any modern pollen to compare it with. And as far as we know, all the pollen on the Shroud, whether it's compared by me or compared by Max Frei, has been compared against a modern sample to try and find out whose it is or what kind it is. Yes, and I may say that there's a popular trope that goes around going, extinct pollen has been found on the Shroud. Whereas if you read the articles in Shroud Spectrum International, which was a publication that lasted for some time, and all its issues are now available on shroud.com, Barry's shroud.com site, you can find that people say, I think Werner Bulst, who was Max Frei's translator into English, says no extinct pollen was found on the Shroud at all. There's quite a lot of discussion as to whether the limestone was covered in, whether the pollen was covered in a kind of limestone coating or something like that, because I think Giovanni Rigi, who had a very clever way of extracting stuff from the Shroud, he had a tiny vacuum cleaner, and so this micro vacuum cleaner, and he went around sucking out dust and stuff off the Shroud and from the space in between the Shroud and the backing cloth. And he said that all the pollen that he found had been had deteriorated because it was covered in a kind of, or we would say it's got a limestone coating, whereas Frei insisted that all his pollen wasn't covered in coating at all. It was all fine.
Did Max find pigment on the Shroud from his samples?
His samples would be extremely interesting, because the samples taken by the Sturp team used a special machine for pushing sellotape onto or sticky tape, what do you call it, Scotch tape, onto the Shroud, and they were terrified, with good reason, I'm not blaming them for this, that they might stick it on so tightly that when they pulled it off, it pulled half the Shroud off with it and made a tear in it. So their machine pushed the sticky tape on really lightly. I mean, it was a very gentle touch. So it only took off the very surface fibers and any pollen grains or dust that happened to be on the very top. Whereas Frei, who after all had already done this in 1973, so he knew how robust the Shroud actually was, he used his thumbnail to go like this and really grind the sticky tape into the cloth. So he would have pulled off a lot more than any of the Sturp team did. So his sticky tape would be really interesting, but he didn't do any work on that at all, only on pollen. So yeah, if there was pigment, he'd have found it, but he didn't research it.
One of the best arguments that people say for the Shroud is the Pray Codex.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
I think people often take the Pray Codex very out of context. It's a very classic example of a particular kind. There we go. It's a very classic example of a particular kind of illustration. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, if you did an illustration of something, it tended to follow a pattern. You couldn't come up with a new and imaginative way of doing things for a very good reason, and that is that nobody could read. So if your picture was of, I don't know, Jesus preaching to the apostles, unless it followed the pattern of where Jesus was and where the apostles were, it could have been just anybody. And so pictures tended to follow a particular theme. Now, this particular one, the enlarged one on the right-hand side, is usually called either the Visitatio or the Three Marys. And the people on the right-hand side are the Three Marys, and they've come to the tomb. Now, there are thousands of pictures along these lines, and they always have sometimes three Marys, sometimes two, and they always have angels, sometimes one, sometimes two, and they always have a coffin and a lid, and the lid is usually doesn't fit on the coffin. It's a bit skewed every single time, and this one is no exception. That big rectangle with crosses all over it is quite clearly the sarcophagus or coffin, and then the flat rectangular thing on top of it with the zigzags is the lid of the coffin. And that fits in with literally thousands of other examples. So for people to go, well, in this particular case, those two rectangles are actually meant to represent the shroud is so vanishingly unlikely that I would disagree with that completely. And I've written certain podcasts and produced a massive poster for the conference that we held in Toronto a little while ago, showing the way that this Three Marys iconography invariably shows these certain themes. The shroud is nearly always present in the picture, and there it is there, all crumbled up on top of the lid of the coffin. There's a very curious A or possibly CL or possibly D written just above it, which nobody really knows what it is. But anyway, but that indicates the shroud sitting on top of the coffin there. So I don't agree. Various things. Someone has found these little circles, and you can see the little circles if anyone's watching this and is not familiar with this particular illustration, which I may say on my screen is about life size there. Just below and to the right of the A, sort of Gothic A, there is a pattern of 1, 2, 3, 4 little circular dots, which I will draw there amongst the zigzags. And there we go. And a little bit further down on the other rectangle, there is a similar pattern, but I think it's got the dots in a square. Is that right? Can you go back to the one you had before? Down a bit further down, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 dots, and possibly one there on the one with all the crosses on it. Yeah, I think that'll do. And it is various people's contention that an L-shaped set of dots must be derived from some similar L-shaped sets of dots which are on the shroud. And the reason they say that it must be that is because they can't think of any other reason why the artist would have put those dots in. Now, to be perfectly honest, I can't think of a good reason why the artist put those dots there. As I say, he put one set of dots which do look a bit in the same orientation as the ones on the shroud, although I have to say the shroud has 4 sets of these things, but he has another set of dots which are nothing like the ones on the shroud. What's more, and this is an interesting little experiment, and that is, if you ask people, if you asked me or if I asked you, if I gave you a rectangle and I said, I want you to replicate as best you can or put some sort of indication of the herringbone weave of the shroud, my guess is that you'd probably perhaps do this. Which is a little bit what the shroud looks like. Yeah? You might, I think, perhaps do lines like that and go... That's another way that you might do it like that. You might do it like that. What you would never, ever, ever do is this. This is just so bizarre that it cannot possibly be an attempt to replicate the zigzag pattern on the shroud. So why on earth is that lid represented with that extraordinary pattern? And you can see, if you go back, if you've got the big picture of the Pray manuscript, you'll see that it's there. All right, can you see we've got little zigzag pyramids coming down from above, coming up from below, sticking out from the side. Now, it is absolutely not credible to me that is an attempt to draw a herringbone weave. So what is it an attempt to draw? Well, we find, especially, I may say, with some of the pictures of the epitaphios, which was, in particular, not necessarily Hungarian, but Bulgarian or Slavonic way of drawing the burial slab upon which Christ was laid for the anointment, and that is often drawn as if it was a kind of onyx, a stone, a marble, a sort of a white marble stone with some red patterning in it, and that's often drawn as if it looked a bit like this, because the red patterns in the stone actually look a bit like that. And now, I suppose I should find an epitaphios showing exactly that so that I can illustrate it for you. But if you keep talking, I'll find it on my other machine, and then, well, no, I won't. I'll try and find it on here. So you'll still be able to see me, but I'll be, I hope, fiddling around on my screen. Let's see if I can. So, yeah, keep chatting for the time being, and I'll share the screen later.
I thought it was very interesting that you claim to have the only correct herringbone weave in the world.
Yeah.
And I think you said it was Chicago, a guy from Chicago, and then somebody from London.
Hang on, I can't find it. No, it's not liking me to find the epitaphios. I may have to find it somewhere else. Right. You're confusing two things there. Firstly, this is a bit of a a bit of a wild statement. Every now and then, I find that my fellow shroud enthusiasts are a bit shy of coming forward. So I make a preposterous statement because they love finding that I've said something wrong. So if I make a preposterous statement, there's a good chance that if anyone's got the slightest objection to it, they'll be able to produce that objection really quickly. Usually with a very smug expression on their faces. Not that they express it very much. But so if I say I've got the only authentic piece of shroud ever made, if anybody else has got one, they'll come snapping back going, oh, no, I've got one that's just as good. But nobody ever has, and I've never seen one illustrated. Ray Rogers and his team, they got a lady called Kate Edgerton to make some 3-in-1 herringbone weave using hand spun linen. But the pictures of it, of examples of it, which you can see in some of Ray's papers, they're very, very loose weave. You can see right through them. You can see holes through the weave so that you can see the back like that. And the shroud is very, very tightly put together. People who've managed to get hold of an Italian book about the weave of the shroud, the name of the man escapes me, like Pierre or something like that. He's got a little bit of shroud, which is sellotape or sticky tape to the front of the book, so you can see what it looks like. But that's obviously been mass produced by a machine and cut into little sections so that it could be put on hundreds of, maybe thousands of copies of his book. So I decided that I wanted a bit of the shroud made as much as possible to look like the shroud. So I sent all the specifications. The thickness of the thread, the flaxen thread, is incredibly thin compared to your average bed sheet. It's about twice as, each bit is about twice as thin. And then it had to be woven so that it had about, whatever it was, 30 threads per centimeter. 30 threads per centimeter. That's fine weaving. And 25 threads in the other direction, and so on, with exactly the same specifications as were made by Gabriel Vial, who was the textile specialist who examined the shroud after the little snippet had been taken off for radiocarbon dating, and wrote down a very precise definition of exactly what defined the shroud as a textile. And so I got a lady called Ruth Gilbert who lives up in Yorkshire, and who makes historical reproductions of historical textiles. And she made me a piece of 3-in-1 herringbone weave, and it was very expensive. But it was as close to the shroud as it's possible to get. Just wondering if I've got it right here. He looks aside. Sometimes it's available, but I thought I had a piece of it. But now I've been experimenting, and it's in my science laboratory, so I haven't got it with me. But I've illustrated it in some articles on in the British Society for the Turin website, which is they're all on Barry Schwartz's site, shroud.com. So that was the weave of the shroud, and it's very interesting because it is so tightly woven that if you get, and I did this much to the horror of people who are frightfully irritated by it, if you get a felt tip or a pen like this and you just scribble on it like that, sure enough, the ink doesn't go through to the other side. In fact, ink, on the whole, if you've got a tightly woven cloth, the ink does not go through to the other side. It doesn't go into the threads, and it stays on the surface, which is exactly what you'd expect, because that's what the shroud also has its markings entirely on the surface. Now,
all right, guys. So after this interview was over, Mr. Farey sent me a video of him scribbling over a bas relief of a Bhutanese dragon. And then there's also 3 still photos. That's a negative, positive, and then one with a 3D effect. And on top of that, Mr. Farey has wrote a blog post on the 1,000-pound challenge, which is if anybody can recreate the linen cloth the way it originally was, he's offering $1,000.
the other thing I did, and again, at the time, and as far as I know, I'm still the only person who's ever had this done formally, was that the invisible mending hypothesis is that the shroud had a mend which was done by not just getting a patch and sewing it around the outside so that it looked like a kind of cartoon patch. You get a patch like that, and here are your stitches. Well, that's so obvious that that couldn't possibly have happened. However beautiful the patch was compared to the rest of the shroud, you could see the stitches very clearly, and you could see the edge of the patch. However, the theory is that if you have a hole in a, I have to say, a particularly beloved and expensive suit or dress, you can send it off to be invisibly mended. Now, when you invisibly mend something, I I'm going to draw some lines here. I'm sorry, these pens are a bit. So here is a piece of cloth. Yeah. And you make a hole in it. So in order to mend this cloth, instead of, there's not much you can do, you get another piece of exactly the same thread, which you usually get from, if it's a pair of trousers or a suit, you get it from the hem of the turn-ups of the trousers or the turn-ups of the wrist. So you've got exactly the same thread, and you thread it through the cloth in exactly the same way as the previous one was, like that. Whoops, that's got to go through to that. And in this way, you make the mend look almost exactly like the, I'm not going to do this very well, but anyway, and you thread it through, and the mend looks almost exactly like the original weave. Now, if it's just an ordinary, what we call tabby weave, just over and under and over and under, that's not very difficult. But even if it's a herringbone weave or a twill weave, you can still match it exactly so that it looks, from when you just look at it at a distance, it looks absolutely identical. And this is called the French method of invisible weaving. Was very popular at one time in America. A man whose surname was Bogolub, I don't know whether he was naturalized American or had come from Eastern European or something like that, but Bogolub is an interesting thing. But he started a company in which he gave franchises to people who to carry out this invisible weaving, sent them lots of kit on how to do it, and produced manuals called the Frenway Invisible Mending Handbook, and showed you how to do it. And this is the way that's still carried on in Chicago by Michael Ehrlich. His company is called withoutatrace.com. And there's a number of other companies in Britain and France who do this invisible mending. But it's not invisible to someone who looks at it closely. For a start, the threads are running alongside each other, so you can see where the old threads and the new threads, they're suddenly double thickness around the edges of the patch. And for a second, the ends of the new threads remain visible. Even if you tuck them in tightly, you can still find them on one side or the other. So invisible mending, and again, I produced, it's all very expensive. And there's one thing that shroud enthusiasts are not keen on, and that's spending any money. Except for me, I spend a fortune. And that is, I sent 2 handkerchiefs, one to Chicago and one to London, with a little hole in, saying, can you mend these tiny little holes? And they said, yes, that's fine. It'll be $100 plus postage. But so I said, yep, go ahead, do it. And indeed, they did it, and they produced it. And on the one side, it's absolutely brilliant. You can hardly tell the difference except just around the edges of the holes where you can see that the patches are a bit thicker. But on the back, of course, we can see where the cut edges pop back out, and you can see them quite clearly. So anybody who thinks that invisible mending using the Frenway system is actually invisible is deluding themselves. And you'll still find people who claim that this somehow can be done. But I've never seen an example of it, in spite of challenging people to produce one.
Any type of ink that you've tested on it, it never went through the other side?
If you get very runny ink, yes, it can do. And blood, which is particularly runny, does go through to the other side. It goes between the threads. Funnily enough, the blood, it doesn't penetrate the threads. And this was discovered also by the 1973 Italian Scientific Commission. And this is another thing which is assumed to be unique to the shroud, but is in fact unique. Is in fact common to just about any kind of tightly woven thread. If I do a thread sideways on, and it's got these little fibrils. I've chopped, this is a transverse section through a thread, which, as many people will illustrate, consists of between 100 and 200 flax fibrils. Now, if you pour something so liquid as blood onto that, the blood will flow round it. And even if there are other threads here and here and here and here, it'll flow between the threads. But what it doesn't do is go into the thread. It may just go in and the top few, like that. And this was noticed as long ago as 1973 by the Italian Commission. Now, unfortunately, the Americans in 1978, they didn't take any threads. They've never seen any threads from the shroud. All they got was their sticky tape samples off the top. So they were only able to make this kind of inference by observation, and the only observations that they had at the time were some microphotographs, good microphotographs taken by Mark Evans in 1978 of the bits of the weave of the shroud in position on the shroud, and what they could glean from the little fragments that they managed to extract from the surface.
Why do you think the blood is still red today on the shroud?
It's a strange kind of pink. It's not blood red, funnily enough. Now, one of the reasons is that there's hardly any of it left. It's nearly all brushed off. But I think it's probably an artificial stain. And Giulio Fanti, the Italian researcher, probably the leading Italian researcher into the shroud, who is, I think it would be fair to say, who is fanatically authenticist, and I mean totally dedicated to the authenticity of the shroud. But he thinks that the bloodstains have been augmented by a paint, such as, for example, rose madder, which does stay red for much longer. Well, stays red all the time, and which has sunk into the cloth. So whereas the sort of crusty bits of blood have broken off, you're left with this pale pink colouring left behind.
What are your thoughts on Walter McCrone saying that it was red pigment?
It's very difficult to say. There's not a lot of pigment on the shroud. I think we can probably say that. And just about everybody who's looked at the shroud has noticed pigment on it. Even the Sturp team, Heller and Adler and people like that, looking at their microscope slides, they're covered in dots. And a lot of their slides were then photographed in enormous detail by Eugenian Nitowski and Joseph Kolbeck, the same people who analysed the limestone. And their photographs are available from Barry. And you can see that every slide is covered in dots. So there's particles of various kinds. Now, in the, 200-word summary that was passed out at a press conference in the final Sturp meeting in, when was it, 1986, was it, or something like that? The one that Barry's just put the recordings of. They made this big announcement: there is no pigment on the shroud. Whereas the peer-reviewed summary of the investigations, which was written by Larry Schwalb and Ray Rogers and published in Analytica Chemica Acta, I think, something like that, says that they wasn't easy to spot pigment using a times 50 microscope. Now, you can't see, most of this pigment is submicron in size. You can't see it at all except at about times 100. So it's possible that there was a lot of pigment which Heller and Adler simply didn't see because it was too small. And but if we look at it ourselves now, we can see it much more clearly. So we can see that lots and lots of threads look a bit like this. Now, I don't think there's enough pigment to make an image, but that doesn't mean that there's no pigment there. So you've got a microfiber and you've got these dots. They look like that. And they have to be seen under at least times 100 in order to spot them at all. I mean, this is only a few microns wide anyway. Now, so what is it and how did it get there? Well, Adler speculated that it was left over from the retting process. I mean, he admitted that there were particles there, and they were iron oxide. And he thought that if the shroud had been retted, which means if the flax from which the shroud had been lying in a river, which was perhaps quite a peaty river or something like that, and some of the iron particles dissolved in the river water might have ion exchanged with some of the particles of the cellulose, and it could have stained the cellulose. And he described a Spanish method of making khaki, which had a similar process about it, that the iron particles might have come from that. So the fact that the particles are there is fairly well acknowledged, and the question is, why are there not enough of them to make an image, and they're too small to see? And how did they get there? But if there's not enough of them to make the image, then what's the image made of? Well, McCrone, he kept changing his mind. At one point, he thought that the whole shroud was entirely made of red ochre, and that if you washed off the red ochre particles, there'd be nothing left. And then after a while, he realized that the image especially is associated with the fibers themselves going slightly yellow, and that the image is perhaps more associated with either the medium that the particles were carried in, or some other stain altogether. Now, I'm slightly of the opinion now that it might be a stain, that the image might have been painted in something called iron acetate, which was a fairly common stain at the time, and still you can buy it as a wood stain now, and that discolors the whole surface of the thread rather than leaving particles on it. So that's a possibility rather than particles.
Are there any experts in painting that have looked at the shroud?
Not in any great detail. No, I would have to say there was possibly the best Italian painting identification expert looked at the shroud in 1973 and decided that it was a painting. Since then, a couple of others have looked at it, but more on stylistic ground. Gary Vican, who was head of the Baltimore Art Museum for a long time, he's decided that it was a painting as well. But I don't think anybody has examined it microscopically. No art historian has examined it sufficiently microscopically to be able to say one thing or the other.
Do you think there are tests today that we can do to prove that it's not authentic, like 100% not authentic?
Probably, yes. I think less than 1978. A group of, it sounds very British, this, but a group of atomic weapons specialists decided that they could, as it were, bombard the shroud with technology and were bound to find the answer. And they didn't find the answer, and paper after paper after paper says we've got no idea what we were looking at. After all this, the X-rays, the infrared radiography, the photographs of the shroud taken from in front, taken in ultraviolet light, taken from the back, never seemed to establish anything. The sticky tapes, it's now acknowledged, were just taken the very surface debris off the shroud, which may not be indicative of anything terribly much. And there are various groups of people. For example, the art historian, the forensic art historians who examined. Do you know? You've heard of the Museum of the Bible?
Yes.
Yes. Well, among its prized possessions at one point were a dozen or so samples of the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And somebody queried whether one of these fragments was actually authentic, and they were all sent off to a forensic historians who examined them microscopically and said no, they were all fake. So I don't think they're no longer on display as original fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But so there are forensic art historians. Now, I have to say, Walter McCrone's bunch of people at McCrone Associates, he authenticated a couple of artists' works of different provenances, and he also found that others were false. I don't know whether they still do that in America. I don't know, but there are certainly British art forensic people who are forever working on fragments of paintings from Leonardo da Vinci, or alleged da Vinci's, or alleged Van Goghs is another one, and things like that. And I think if any of those were given access to the shroud, they would very soon work out what exactly they were looking at.
What are your thoughts on the carbon dating? Because they claim that the sample they took has cotton in it and it's not an accurate result.
Yes, they do. How strange. I think there was a time when people decided that the whole thing was falsified, that either the Archbishop of Turin and the scientific director of the British Museum secretly swapped all the samples around in Turin so that the shroud would be proved to be medieval. Now, why the Archbishop of Turin would want to prove the shroud medieval, I don't know. Somebody else thought that that maybe the KGB was anxious to prove that the shroud was not authentic because Stalinist Russia was very atheist and were determined to prove that that the shroud was medieval. It's not authentic, because if the shroud was proved authentic, then Christianity would be demonstrated true, and therefore the whole ideal Stalinist atheist ideology would crumble. Anyway, none of that seems particularly it's not well substantiated, and it all seems rather far-fetched. I can't believe that most people cared two hoots what the Turin shroud was going to come out as. So now nearly everybody thinks that the sample was taken, that it was properly divided up, that the laboratories got their pieces of sample from the place where they said it had come from, and that they correctly determined the proportion of radiocarbon in that sample. Now, I think that's important, because when we carbon date something, we tend to go through now a rather archaic three-stage process. You first find the proportion of radiocarbon. From that, you derive what's called a radiocarbon age, which is the before present age, and you then convert that into what we might call the calendar age, the years AD. And it is the contention of nearly everybody, even the shroud authenticists, that the laboratories got this bit right. There's something in the region of 93% of the carbon-14 that would be present in a modern sample is present on the shroud. I'm going to write it down there, and probably people will go, no, it was 95 or 89 or something. But for a first century piece of cloth, it should be something like 73%. So if we convert this following this pattern along, we find, sure enough, that it's round about the 1400s. And if we've had this amount, we would have found that it was 1st century. But there isn't. That's definitely wrong. That's definitely right. So if you want to say that the radiocarbon dating was wrong, nowadays you have to say, why might this be wrong? And there are two main competing theories. The first one is Joe Marino's invisible mending theory, which is that only something like 40 or 50%, less than that, 30 or 40% of the shroud is original of that particular area, and the rest of it is part of some mending process which is completely invisible and was carried out by the Empress Clotilde in the early 16th century. People who don't read Joe's papers very much think that he said that it was carried out by the Poor Clare nuns in 1534 as a result of repairing the shroud after the fire. But that's not Joe's contention, and it doesn't make any sense. So that's Joe's idea. And the other one is Bob Rucker's idea. And his idea is that a piece of cloth which doesn't have much carbon-14 in it was irradiated during the resurrection with a whole lot more carbon-14. And that therefore, so many years later, it has much more carbon-14 in it than it should have. Now, for either of these to be substantiated, we need some kind of evidence for it. Well, we can have a pretty good, a close look at fragments. There are some quite good photographs of the fragments that were actually radiocarbon dated, and Barry Schwartz took some very good photographs of some a fragment that the Arizona laboratory still has of a bit of the radiocarbon sample that it didn't date. And there is absolutely no evidence of any extra weaving, which means that Joe Marino's interweaving hypothesis is slightly defeated by the fact you can't see any extra weaving, although I will come back to that in a minute. Now, Bob has absolutely no evidence for any extra carbon dating, extra carbon-14 at all. But he predicts that if the shroud, if the man on the shroud, and I'm going to pretend it's folded over here, so he's lying on the shroud like that. Now, if as he resurrected, there was a burst of neutrons escaping, and he doesn't pretend that the whole body exploded into neutrons or anything like that. He's a nuclear physicist. He knows that if you convert 30 kilograms of man, 100 kilograms of man into pure energy, he would have blown Jerusalem apart. He suggests that a tiny amount of the deuterium, which is the heavy hydrogen, which can be found in any sample of hydrogen, and there are hydrogen atoms in the human body, if a tiny amount of that was converted into neutrons, the radiation would have increased the carbon-14 on the cover around the body enormously. So much so that if it was tested today, it would appear to date something way into the 22nd or 23rd centuries. But it got less and less and less towards the edges of the shroud, so that round about here, which is where the sample was taken from, there'd be about 93%, which would indicate that the shroud came from the 13th century, when in fact the extra carbon-14 was created by radiation from the body. Now, it's a good guess. It explains a lot of things, and it has absolutely no evidence for it whatever. However, as Bob points out, if we took a sample, a tiny thread from somewhere around here on the shroud, maybe between the hands or just to the ones between the two heads or something like that, then we would find a radiocarbon date of into the 23rd century, which would very much justify this hypothesis. So his hypothesis has not been tested, but is easily testable. Now, if I can just go back to Joe. So we've got no visible evidence of any kind of reweaving, but one of the great things about postulating an invisible elephant is that if you can't see it, that's evidence that it exists. At least according to some forms of logic. However, by studying the area, a bit of cloth from the area, sure enough, some cotton threads were found amongst the sample. And Ray Rogers' idea was that there was only cotton in this little sample, and there wasn't any cotton on the rest of the shroud. However, he hadn't examined the rest of the shroud, of course. There is cotton found on the sticky tape slides in not great abundance, but there's bits all over it. Those two people who have actually taken a thread and counted each thread to find out how much cotton there is on it have discovered that there is a proportion of between 5 and 15 or so % cotton. In 1978, Stirp team said that some of the blood samples, fibers that they'd seen, the blood was on cotton fibers. So there is cotton all over the shroud, and the fact that there is some in the radiocarbon area is not, to my mind, evidence that the radiocarbon area has been doctored.
Has the shroud ever been tested for radiation?
I don't think so. Not to my knowledge. Nor, which would be also very interesting because it would work just as well, was the Holy Sepulchre itself tested for radiation during the massive restoration project, which happened a few years ago. All the scientific data for that has been published, and none that I've seen has mentioned any test for radiation. As far as I know, it hasn't been tested, but it would be possible, and it would be very interesting.
What are your thoughts on the face cloth, Sudarium?
The Sudarium of Oviedo has been radiocarbon dated 4 times. And every time it has been come out dated to round about 700 AD, which is about the date when it was almost certainly manufactured. I think it was manufactured in southern Spain. It has a limestone signature similar to that of southern Spain. And it was then transported up to northern Spain, where it is now. It was, to my mind, almost certainly a blood-soaked cloth, perhaps put over the head of a notable Spanish warrior in the fight against the Moors, who were invading southern Spain at just that time, and got quietly subsumed into being, instead of a cloth to remind us of one of our more beloved military leaders in Spain, let's have a cloth of Jesus. It's had a shift of emphasis. I don't think it has anything to do with the shroud. I don't find any correspondence between the marks on it and the shroud. They loosely correspond. The main blood marks loosely correspond to a face, but everyone's got a face. There's nothing that pins it down, except for 2 things, which I will mention in a minute. There's nothing that pins it down that makes it look as if it was specifically from the shroud. Mark Guskin, who's probably done more work on it than anybody else, explains in detail how it was attached to a dead body whose head was jammed so tightly against his arm that you couldn't fit the cloth around the head. Now, people who follow shroud studies think that the shroud body was in rigor mortis, and the head is not jammed to one side. It's very rectilinear. It's in the straight line. So that would suggest that the two the two shapes are not compatible with each other. Now, the two bloodstains which are supposed to correspond exactly are some dots on the back of the on what would be the back of the Sudarium, and similar sort of dots on the back of the shroud. And sure enough, there's some splodges that look like this on the one, and there's some splodges that look like this on the other. And you go, they're in the right place, they match each other perfectly. But actually, if you superimpose the one on the other with any kind of accuracy, you find that they don't match. And the fact that they are so precise means that the patterns ought to be much more similar than they really are. So I'm afraid I think of those dots as being just entirely coincidental, that they happen to be in roughly the same place. They don't match each other at all. The other one, which has appeared recently, and I think is quite strange in a way, is that if we look at the shroud, we see a blood mark which looks like this. I may have got it the wrong way around, but it's usually called an epsilon because it looks a bit like a Greek E, and it's got a sort of teardrop on the end of it. You'll be familiar with it. It's just above the eyebrows. And on the shroud, it appears to be more or less rubbed away in the middle. And in roughly the right place on the Sudarium, there's no sign of this, but there is a single pink blob. And it was somebody's idea that the pink blob is this bit, which was transferred onto there. I'm afraid I don't agree with it. I don't agree with it for two reasons. Firstly, the pink blob is miles too big. It's bigger than the whole of this teardrop anyway. And secondly, the pink blob, like the rest of the bloodstains on the face of the Sudarium, is only made of a tiny bit of blood and a huge amount of serum. I think it's 6-1. Whereas this is very much made of solid, thick blood. So I'm not convinced of the identity of those two. And those are the only two places in which the Sudarium and the shroud are even supposed to match, let alone actually do match.
The Sudarium and the shroud, and then also Eucharistic miracles, they claim that it's AB blood.
Yes. Well, I sort of explained this on another podcast, which is the problem of identifying blood. If you've got some blood which you take from a cut on your finger, you know it's blood. You know it's not cheese or tomato sauce or Jello or anything like that. And so if you can identify certain proteins on it, you know that those proteins must have come from the blood. And blood is typified by certain proteins, which we might describe as, here's a red blood cell, and sometimes I draw them as spikes. This we will call the A protein, and sometimes I'll draw them as blobbles, which we will call the B protein. Now, the trouble is that if you don't know the provenance of your sample, and if it comes from an old piece of cloth, and indeed the blood sample from the Sudarium, the person who did the blood typing said we have to be extremely cautious because he was sampling not just blood, but also bacteria and plant remains. And the fact is that these antibodies also occur independently of any blood in bacteria and things like that. So simply identifying these antibodies does not tell you that you've got AB blood. It tells you that you've got AB antibodies. Now, there is another way of identifying blood, which is the reverse typing. And that is that if you've got A blood, then you have anti-A. No, you don't. You have anti-B. Sorry, there we go. You have anti-B in your blood plasma, which is why you can't give B blood to an A blood person as a blood transfusion, because the A person's anti-Bs will reject it. Similarly, if you've got B blood, then you have anti-A in your bloodstream. Yeah? But of course, if you have AB blood, then you can't have any anti-B because you'd reject your own blood. And you can't have any anti-A because you'd reject your own blood. So you have no antibodies in your blood serum. But unfortunately, Jello and tomato ketchup don't have any anti-A or anti-B in it either, because it's not blood. So neither identifying the proteins on something which you're not sure is blood in the first place, nor identifying the lack of antigens on in the serum can definitely show you that the blood is AB. And the testing of ancient samples and coming up with the idea that it's all AB is, I think, extremely doubtful. Now, I'm not a blood specialist, but Kelly Kearse, who's a member of the Shroud Science Group, is a blood specialist, and most of what I've just told you comes from him. So it's, but we're identifying things as AB blood. You need to be very careful that you are testing only blood and nothing else. Otherwise, you're in trouble.
Yeah, I actually talked to him about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
He thinks it is blood on the shroud. Blood is present, but he says that, there's no definitive answer of what it actually is. I think he said cow and horse. It couldn't be cow or horse.
Well, there are, yes. But the thing was that we find that there's so many other things that also produce a similar reaction. He went originally for primate, primate but not human, and now he thinks we can't even be sure that it's primate blood. I mean, the fact that we can think it's blood at all is worthwhile, and I think I agree with him there. But also, I have to say that if I did want to put, if I was making an object for devotion, even if it wasn't a relic, and I wanted to use real blood, in the medieval times, the most common surgical procedure was a thing called bloodletting. Whenever you felt a bit off colour, when you had flu or a headache or a stomach upset or a bit of an ache in your back, you sat down for half an hour while somebody drained blood out of your arm. There was no shortage of human blood if that's what you wanted. So you didn't need to go and find a gorilla or cut open a chicken or anything like that.
If you were to fake a shroud, I'm assuming you would want to make the image first and then add the blood after.
Yeah, I think you probably would. And I think I think that's probably what happened. The evidence that Heller and Adler came up with to suggest that there was no image under the blood is very weak, in my opinion. Firstly, what they mentioned was that when they looked at the shroud fibers on the sticky tape, they decided that the fibers that were most heavily associated with the image were corroded, and that the fibers that were least heavily associated with the image, especially the ones which weren't next to the image at all, were not corroded. Now, we're not exactly sure what they mean by corroded, but to my mind, that means that they were perhaps pitted or rough or irregular or something like that. So perhaps let's say that a shroud image fiber is this is a bit of an exaggeration, pitted like that, whereas a non-image fiber looks like that. Now, the thing is that neither I, who've looked through all Eugenia Nitowski's slides, nor Eugenia Nitowski can find that that's true. We don't find this corrosion on some kinds of shroud fibers and not on others. And authenticists have had as much opportunity to look through these slides as I have, and I've not seen anybody who's been able to come up and say, look, these are the image fibers, look how corroded they are. They don't look corroded at all to me. So it was Heller and Adler's contention that where blood had landed on a fiber, that it was not corroded, and therefore it didn't look like an image fiber, and therefore there was no image under the blood. Remember that they had no way and had never even seen the image on the shroud, neither of them. They didn't go to Turin and they didn't see the shroud. They were working from microscopic fibers from the tops of threads. The other reason I think they may have been mistaken is that a thread, if I draw a piece of shroud thread, one of these blues works better than the other, and I can't remember which one it is. It's that one. Well, neither of them work particularly. So here is a shroud thread. There and there and there. And this is one in between. Yeah? And this is the one I'm going to go for. So let's there it is like that. Now, the image, if this thread bulges out a bit, the image appears to be just mostly on a few threads there. Whereas the blood is all over the place. So that if you get any particular blood thread, the chances are that it won't have any image underneath it anyway. And that may be another reason why they found non-imaged threads underneath the blood. But I think basically I've not seen demonstrated that the image threads are as corroded as Heller and Adler thought they saw. So that's my response to that. So I think the blood was added after the image.
In your opinion, do you think it was some type of ink to make the image on the shroud?
Yes. Now, ink comes in 3 or 4 forms. Essentially, your ordinary ink consists of a pigment, which we might call a black powder, and something to carry the pigment in, which might be water. Now, obviously, if you stirred up some carbon and water and you paint it on a cloth, you'll get a mark. But if you fold up the cloth and roll it around, let it dry, most of the carbon will fall off, possibly all of it. So the stuff that you put the carbon in also incorporates a glue of some kind. So that an oil paint, an emulsion that you paint your wall with or anything like that, has got a pigment, a medium to carry it in, and some kind of glue, and which we call a binder. And in the case of the shroud, Walter McCrone thought that he'd spotted a binder extracted from the gelicet parchment, basically, or possibly rabbit skin. Even now, you can buy rabbit skin binder. The binder might also have a colouring effect itself. It could actually stain the cellulose of the material. After all, if you think of the difference between if I wash this coat that I'm wearing, if I put some red paint on it and then I put it in a washing machine, the red paint washes off, but the color doesn't, and that's because it's not just sitting on the top of the surface. It's actually reacted with the cellulose. Well, this is probably made of plastic, but it's reacted with the cellulose of the material to produce a dye. And that's what Adler was speculating the iron oxide might be doing. It might be producing a dye, which wasn't a pigment at all, but which nevertheless was able to color the threads of the cloth.
You wrote an article on your website. It's called "Talk to the Hand."
Oh yes,
and it's the palm versus wrist situation there. Maybe you could go into that and tell us what you think about that.
Yes, I've done a lot of work on this, and in some ways I've quite cheekily changed my mind in offered alternatives. But this is a lovely one. So, if I decide, as you can see, that's absolutely right. There's my wrist. And you can see that black and red line shows where I've decided the wrist is. And I've put the angle between my knuckles. I'm just now drawing some dots. Now, the knuckles are more or less visible on the shroud. Whoops, let me get the angle right. There we go. And you can see my knuckles painted red there. So if I now draw an angle between those red dots and where the wrist is, and I bent my wrist there, we can see that it's blue on the picture that's illustrated, and it's red on my actual wrist, and it's an angle of about 45 degrees. However, the mark on the shroud is not at an angle of 45 degrees, it's at an angle of more like 90 degrees, which suggests that it's not in the wrist. In that case, there we go. It's not 45 degrees, it's 64 degrees, which is a little wider, which has brought the mark in, not as closely as I was hoping, but into about there. Now, the question is, you might go, this is all very silly, but we must ask ourselves, when people say the wound is not in the palm of the hand, the fact is that you can't see the palm of the hand, and people forget this. And people go on and on and on going, look at a million medieval depictions of the crucifixion, and you'll find that the nail goes through the palm of the hand. But this is completely the wrong thing to do, because we can't see the palm of the hand. If you want to know what medieval artists thought, then, there we go. That's further on to the wrist. If you want to know what medieval artists thought, you must look at medieval pictures of the back of the hand. And there is, thank goodness have you got all those illustrations by Giotto and people like that of the Lamentation, which show the medieval artists' versions of where the blood is on the back of the hand thing anyway. But, encourage your viewers to go and look at Talk to the Hand on medievalshroud.com, and there you will find all the, several examples of medieval pictures of Jesus after he's come down from the cross. So you're looking at the back of the hand. And there you'll see that medieval artists put the blood in exactly the same place as where it is put on the shroud. So the whole thing about the nails going through the palms is a bit of a red herring. Pierre Barbet, who was followed by Sturp's resident pathologist, Robert Bucklin, from Los Angeles, I think, coroner's office. Both of them decided that the nail had gone through a particular division bordering between several of the bones of the wrist. This, according to Pierre Barbet, and according to him, by experiment, pierced a nerve. He only did it with dead people, I have to say. He didn't do it with live people. But according to Barbet, pierced a nerve which resulted in the thumb snapping in like that. The trouble is that at the time, in 1930 or so, no one could say that doesn't usually happen. But now we can. We know very much what happens to damage of the median nerve wherever it occurs, and it never, ever, ever results in that. It results in all sorts of interesting things, depending where it's cut. We can get something called the claw hand. We can get the hand of benediction, where the outside fingers curl in, but we never get what Barbet thought we got. And the only photographic illustration of Barbet's work shows a dead man who he actually crucified, and sure enough, he's got his wrists, nails through the wrists, but the thumb has not gone in, it's sticking out as supposed. So the Stirp scientist Robert Bucklin and Pierre Barbet went for this particular kind of site, but then there's been this kind of interesting conflict. You perhaps don't notice it in Tennessee, but there's a continuous, I don't know, one-upmanship between the East Coast and the West Coast. New York thinks it's better than California, basically, and vice versa. So if you can produce a Californian pathologist who says this, there's a fair bet that I can produce a New York pathologist who says the opposite. And sure enough, we've got Frederick Zugerby, who was the Rockwell County pathologist's examiner and did an enormous amount of work on crucifixion, even to the extent of crucifying, without actually nailing them, lots of volunteers and things like that. And he decided that both Barbet and Bucklin were completely wrong. The nail did not go through the space that they said it had gone through. It didn't damage the median nerve at all, that the shroud hand just looks like that. And the reason you can't see the wrist is because when you look at a wrist like that, you can't see the wrist. It doesn't have to have been snapped in or anything. I've just twisted it slightly. And also he thought that Bucklin and Barbet had got the cause of death wrong as well, and so on. So for every pathologist who thinks this, there's another pathologist who thinks that. Over in Germany, there was the chairman of the International Society of Forensic Pathology or something, who thought that the shroud man wasn't dead at all and didn't show any signs of rigor mortis and so on. So different pathologists have come up with different ideas.
I'm going to pull up a picture of what people think Jesus was wrapped like.
Yes.
I saw a comment on YouTube, and they were pushing back on your idea of the wrist wound, because they claim that, if Jesus was wrapped like this, it wouldn't be like a straight line, like a 45-degree 64.
That's a good comment. Again, I'll illustrate that, and that is that if the hand is like this, let's draw an arm, a wrist, and a hand. There we go. That's not a very good arm, wrist, and hand, but it'll do. And sure enough, if the and knuckles, here we go, and fingers, and sure enough, we can then say that following my system, that would work. However, if the arm went down to here, and then the wrist went up there, and perhaps the knuckles and the fingers are there, then you can see that if I lay a cloth across here, the distance between the wrist and the knuckles, in fact, isn't that funny? The wrist and knuckles both begin with a letter that they don't sound like. So WR for wrist and KN for knuckles, that distance. Whereas if the cloth goes like this, then wrist and knuckles, the distance is much smaller. Yeah? Which would be explaining, according to them, why the wrist wound is closer to the knuckles than I think it ought to be. Is that making sense to you? Because the shroud is going across the top and the arm is going down and then is bent up. So where am I? Like that. Yeah? Well,
I guess the blood stain is debated, since there's
blood stain here. So in this case, it's further away from the knuckles. But if the wrist is bent like that, then it's closer to the knuckles. So you could still say that even though my angles show that the blood stain is too close to the knuckles to be in the wrist, if the man was bent under the shroud like that, that would explain why a wrist wound can appear closer to the knuckles than it otherwise would do. Now, if that was true, and, it's an idea, we must accept it, but if that was true, one would expect the intensity of the image, which, as we know, relays the distance or compares to the distance of the body from the cloth, we'd expect the intensity of the image to be much the same all the way along there, but we'd expect it to be much fainter if the cloth was laid like that. In fact, we wouldn't expect any image here at all because it's too far away from the cloth. We'd expect to see the blood, which may have seeped onto it, but we wouldn't expect to see image. But in fact, that's not what we see. We see the blood and we see the image all the way through. We see that the back of the hand is well represented from an image point of view, and that therefore the hand was not bent in that formation.
You would say the blood was not dry. It was a wet blood?
I think it was applied wet, yes. Probably with... Nowadays, we would apply it with a teat pipette. You'd suck it in and drop it on. But those days, they would perhaps do it with a feather or a paintbrush or something like that, a brush made of hairs, and dabbed it on.
And then you think the back wounds are not accurate because of that theory, the wet versus dry blood.
The back wounds are a real problem for everybody. Everybody... even people who think that the shroud is authentic discuss for ages whether the wounds themselves show that the man who suffered them was washed or not. They appear only as little circles. There's no sign of any seepage or anything like that. So they were probably there's no evidence that they were wet in any sense before the man laid on the shroud. Well, now, if that is the case, if they were dry when the man laid on the shroud, then they shouldn't have left any mark at all. So some people think that the man was washed just before he was laid on the shroud. But if you've got the idea that the man was washed, why was just his back washed and not, say, his forehead, which had this massive great mark on it, or his arms? It sounds a bit like special pleading that to just choose a particular bit. Now, somebody noticed, and they were right, that the marks look a little bit like this, or most of the marks look a little bit like that. And they knew that they were in the sort of position where you might have been, where they might have occurred if you'd been flogged. And so they invented a whip to go with it. And the illustration that you showed before, you showed 3 whips, one of which was a photograph. That's right, the middle one, which is a reconstruction. And time and again, and the funniest I think is Robert Bucklin, who takes that whip and lays the marks, the things alongside the mark, and says, "Look at this. They match exactly," showing that the marks were made by a Roman flagrum. But the reason they match exactly is because that particular whip was designed to match these marks. So you can't say that the marks exactly match a Roman flagrum when the Roman flagrum was modelled on the marks. Of course they do. What you can say is that if we could find a Roman flagrum that looked anything like that, then that would be fair enough. But in fact, no Roman flagra have ever been found looking anything like that, or indeed anything like even resembling them. Such images that we do have suggest that they were thongs threaded with hollow bones, which were knobbly and ripped you to pieces. There's no suggestion that they were made of little dumbbell shape, or that they had any balls on them, or that the balls were made of metal, or anything like that. There's archaeologically no evidence for that kind of whip at all. It's the sort of whip, a sort of mark that one might make up if one didn't know anything about whips and decided that you would paint the back looking as if they were whips, if you see what I mean. It resembles far more medieval imagination than it does any kind of historical or archaeological discovery.
So those three images I showed, you don't think it would have looked anything like any of those?
No. Well, a Roman, we've got a rough idea what some Roman flagra looked like. There are a few illustrations. They can all be found in an article by Andrea Nicolotti called "The Scourge of Christ," I think it is, who has looked through every conceivable possible illustration of a Roman scourge and whips and things like that, and attempted to identify what it was. Some people have got completely carried away. I think very few people who describe the Passion of Christ from a theological and biblical point of view have looked at the shroud, and possibly vice versa. We see in things like the Passion of the Cross that the whip has actually got hooks on the end, and it indeed is in some Roman texts it's described as having hooks on the end. But the shroud shows no tearing of the skin of the back at all. There's no shredding or flaps of skin or anything like that. It's just these little round bumps, which might be described as abrasions, possibly. I mean, you can raise an abrasion by hitting yourself with a rough stone without actually without cutting the skin. You know, it makes it in a very small amount so that the blood seeps out. But certainly there's nothing to suggest that the skin's been torn or anything like that.
One of the biggest arguments for the shroud is nobody can recreate it, no one can reproduce it with our modern technology. And there was actually a guy who offered $1 million challenge to remake the shroud.
Yeah. Well, I set off on making a blog post, and which I didn't post in the end, but it was a story, and it said, look, can you make me a cake? And the answer is, yeah, of course I can make you a cake. And I say, well, can you make me a cake exactly like my Aunt Agatha used to make a cake? And I go, yeah, what was it like? And I go, it was a fruit cake. So we go, yes, okay, I can make a fruit cake. So I make the fruit cake, and you go, too many cherries. So, oh, sorry, how many cherries do you want me to put in it? So you put in the amount of cherries. And you go, there, I've got it. Not enough raisins. And I go, well, okay, can I have a look at this cake? And I go, no, you can't. But I'll show you a photograph of it. Now, what are the chances of my exactly reproducing a cake with all its ingredients and its cooking time and its icing decorations when all I've got is a photograph of it, probably with all the icing rubbed off? And this is the main problem. We don't know what it is that we're trying to do. And I think that if whoever was offered £1 million, I'd like to have the £1 million first and then promise to pay it back if I can't do it. The first thing I would do would be to go along to the Vatican, the Archbishop of Turin, and say, look, you can have £900,000 if I can have a look at the shroud. And if he said, whoa, yes, for that, it's all yours, I think I would then be able to find out what it is I was trying to make. And then I'd spend the other £100,000 making it, and I'm sure that wouldn't be a problem. I think that is the main problem. not knowing what it is that we're doing. And coupled to that, I think, is also the fact that it's not what it was before. And it's a lot of the blood's certainly worn off. It may have been that it was much more brightly coloured in the past, and that the colouring has either faded or rubbed off. Early descriptions of it very much suggest that the whole image was made of blood. Those sort of people in the 15th century who described it as looking as if the whole image was made of blood, which it doesn't look at all like that now. It's much more sort of faded sepia, as if all the blood has either faded away. This is from areas which are not, as it were, blood areas. That colour, that the colour there has either faded off or been rubbed off, so it isn't there anymore. And then the last thing I would say is something which I, again, occasionally do to the irritation of people, and that is to start with a piece of paper and do this, and then say, I'll give you £1 million if you can replicate that. Now, I don't know how you'd go about that, but I bet you couldn't do it, because I'd look at it and go, wait a minute, you see that wrinkle there? You're 2 millimeters off. And you see that? So there's a certain amount of contingency built in to the way the shroud image has made. It's slightly fortuitous, and it depends on circumstances, which are not necessarily perfectly manufacturable. So that's my answer to the £1 million challenge, or $1 million. See, if you're English, you get £1 million, which is good, because then if you turn that into dollars, it's something like $1,500, whereas you guys just get $1 million. Sorry about that.
That is, I didn't think about that. Have you ever attempted to try to recreate it?
I've attempted all sorts of different possibilities with varying success. One of the things is that for a long time, even some of the Sturp physicists thought that the shroud was a scorch, and it does look. It has exactly the same spectrographic characteristics as the scorches on the side, which we know were made by during the fire. So I produced a number of nothing the size of the shroud, but little blobs made by putting hot brass things against it, which will produce a beautiful negative effect and will also produce a beautiful 3D effect. But it seems to me unlikely that a sufficiently uniform hot brass image could be made that would produce the image on the shroud. So the other thing I'm doing is something that's, I suppose, loosely starting with the brass image that I have, or I've got a wooden bas relief as well, is painting that in various things and then rubbing a cloth against it to seeing how well it will stain. But I haven't got anything that I could say, no, I think I've cracked it. But what I'm going for at the moment is, I think, a pigment with a stain, and I suspect the stain is something like iron acetate. One of the Sturp scientists, a bloke called Joe Assetta, thinks that it was made with a weak oak gall ink, which was a very popular and common ink at the Middle Ages, which has the effect of reacting with the cellulose of the paper, usually, or parchment that it's written on, and staining that. Sometimes it makes it much weaker. So if you used oak gall ink but without the pigment, that perhaps would produce a similar stain, and so on. But I'm definitely going for the print version. It's like a bas relief with a cloth laid on top of it now.
The finances of Troyes Cathedral.
Oh,
if you can talk about that.
Everyone's favorite. Yes. Have you got my chart there? This is the sort of thing that I think is quite important to get into. I think it's important to, if you want to talk about Jerusalem pollen, to find some Jerusalem pollen which isn't on the shroud, which is why I was looking into the drains that ran underneath the streets of Jerusalem. another, the sort of thing that's important to get into is to look at another common claim is that after is that the shroud is the most examined artifact of all time. Well, I don't know how you judge that, but if you look at the number of published papers on, say, the shroud, the pyramids, Titanic, and all that, you find dozens of things which have been, the Taj Mahal, lots of things have been studied a great deal more than the shroud. Another example is that somebody announced that after the carbon-14 date came out, research on the shroud came to a halt for 10 years. Well, again, all you need to do is to go onto something like JSTOR, which is the, a repository of scientific papers on absolutely everything, and find out how many scientific papers were written on the Shroud of Turin every year between, say, 1978 and 1998. And sure enough, you find that there's hardly any drop in numbers after the 1988 dating, and so on. So you have to look into all these background details. So the argument goes that Archbishop Pierre d'Arcy of Troyes found that the shroud was being exhibited in Liry and that the income to Troyes of pilgrims coming there would go down. And so he was disappearing, and he particularly wanted to pay for the collapse of the tower of his cathedral, because it collapsed regularly every 50 years and had to be rebuilt. So he needed more money. So we have a look and see whether we actually know whether he needed more money, where he got his money from, and that sort of thing. And sure enough, we have some records of the income of the revenue produced for Troyes Cathedral in order to mend things. And the crucial date, whoops, here's my graph again, probably in the wrong blue. The crucial date is about 1389 to 90. That's when the cathedral collapsed, and also when, according to him, the shroud started being exhibited at Liry. So we get this kind of thing like this. Now, this is about 1389 and 90. This is when the tower fell down and the cathedral income shot up. And we want to look, unfortunately we can do this too, at where did the income come from? What were the people of Troy? And it came from various different sources. Mostly it came from benefactors, but it also came from little boxes put in churches around the city where pilgrims could put their money in. And we find that the amount of money given by pilgrims didn't change. The fact that the shroud was being exhibited seemed to have no effect. And the fact that the shroud was no longer being exhibited also had no effect. So the idea that the Archbishop was worried that he might lose income is not justified by the actual records of the income of the cathedral.
There's a guy, his name is Robert de Clari, a knight who participated in the Fourth Crusade.
Yes. Robert de Clari from Picardy, northern France, who went off to Constantinople and in a magnificent, it was such fun that in one of my academia papers, I've written his whole description in medieval French, because it's quite easy to read, and it's quite simple and naive and rather charming. And he describes all the wonders of Constantinople, including, I may say, the Mandelion, which was associated with a little clay tile at the time, a cloth and a tile, which were different from the shroud. Other people found that described both of them. And he said, I went to here and I saw all this, and I went to here and I saw all this, and I went to here and I saw all this. And then at the end of the chapter, he goes, oh, and by the way, there's a church also where the image of our Lord arises every Friday afternoon. He doesn't say he saw it. It's not in the it's not in the paragraphs where he's describing the area all around where this church is. It's as if it was thrown in as an afterthought. Now, if it was that significant, it strikes me that it would not be thrown in as an afterthought. Now, the reason I think it's thrown in as an afterthought is because he hasn't seen it, he's been told about it. It probably didn't happen over the time when the Crusaders were actually marching through the city, tearing it to pieces anyway. So, and I think he misconstrued something which actually did happen and is recorded happening by at least 2 and possibly 3 other different sources, which did happen every Friday afternoon in this particular church. And it did involve the raising of a veil and the revealing of a full-length image. But it wasn't Christ, it was the Virgin Mary. And I think he just got that confused because he hadn't seen it himself. And what's more, he said, I don't know what happened to it after that. It disappeared. Whereas bits of the shroud turned up all over the place, and perhaps he should have known where they were because they suddenly arrived in parts of France all over the place. For a long time, I thought he was disgruntled throughout his description. He says it's so unfair because the poor people, poor knights, and he couldn't have been that poor if he was a knight and could afford to go all the way to Constantinople, but the poor knights like him didn't get a look in at all the relics. They were all pinched by all the rich knights, and he didn't get any. But then a bit later on, when he got home, there's another account of him presenting all his relics to local churches. So he did manage to accrue some. But yes, I feel he would have been an entertaining person to interview. But I think he was wrong about that particular image.
I guess you could say you've dedicated a lot of your life and time to researching the Shroud and writing articles on it. Why are you so, I would assume you're interested in it, but you also are disproving it. Why do you feel the need to do that?
I don't feel the need to disprove it. And I think perhaps had I found more evidence that suggested it was real, I'd have been just as ardent in demonstrating the evidence in favor of it. I think I've always been interested in, I've said this a lot, that I'm interested in primary sources, and I'm interested in reading the actual words and seeing the actual images of the people who saw and read things. And over again, I get very irritated by people who haven't read something and yet come across as if they were authoritative. And just recently, 2 videos have appeared on YouTube by people who are generally thought of as experts on the Shroud of Turin, people who say, I've studied the Shroud of Turin for 40 years and that sort of thing. And I can always know after about 3 minutes that they know nothing at all about it. And this is when they go, the VP8 image analyzer, which was used by NASA to produce topographical maps of the moon. And that's just not right. It hasn't been right since the VP8 image analyzer first appeared. No one at NASA has ever used a VP8 image analyzer, which would be particularly useless for making topographical maps of the moon. And if any Shroud researcher in the first 3 minutes of his statement says that, you know that he doesn't really know what he's talking about, however many years he's spent studying the Shroud. And that's the sort of thing that makes me feel, I want to know. And I've looked through just about every NASA record there was. And I found that NASA did, in fact, sponsor somebody who hoped that they would discover something about crop diseases by looking at color photographs of fields, and where the crops were darker, the crops were better, and where the crops were lighter, they weren't growing so well on aerial photographs of fields. And they tried putting that through a VP8 image analyzer in the hope that it would enable them to envisage it slightly better. But it was nothing to do with NASA. It was nothing to do with the moon. But nobody knows that except me. But no one's bothered to research it. And over again, you find things that people don't bother, but never ask themselves, is that true? An argument that's been going on quite a long time on the Real Seekers site, which I occasionally discuss with Dale Glover, and I had this big challenge. Somebody said you can see teeth? The shroud image shows teeth. So I said, really? Can somebody show me where these teeth are? And somebody said, yes, they're here, and just drew a big sort of circle around the mouth. And I said, no, I don't want. Where can you see teeth? I want to see one tooth and then another tooth. Can you actually see any teeth at all? And of course, nobody can. There aren't any teeth on the shroud. You can't see them. You can just sort of say, well, it looks as if to me there might be something there. But that could be done with any old smudge. It doesn't represent actual teeth. And, again, it's like invisible weave. Okay, show me some invisible weave. If you think it can be done using the Frenway system, and if you say that it can be done by Michael Ehrlich of Chicago, get him to do some. And let's have a look at it. But people don't. It was people are absolutely amazed when I said, paint doesn't go through cloth. This announcement, when you put paint on cloth, it seeps through to the other side. And I said, no, it doesn't. Mostly it doesn't. And people were shocked and horrified until you just look at the back of a canvas that an artist has painted on. Look at any kind of, get a handkerchief and scribble on it with a felt tip pen. It doesn't go through to the other side. And people go, oh, well, that's amazing. But we were always told, yeah, but you haven't actually looked at it. I'll tell you one other thing, which I found very inspiring. And that is a chap who's done very little else, but was very good. His name was Aldo Guareschi. Whether he was Italian, it turns out I often pronounce these people with very Italian names, and then it turns out that they're as American as apple pie. But he was a person who looked at the big diagonal water stains that go all the way down the center of the shroud. And until he wrote about this in, 1990 or something like that, everyone had assumed that those water stains were associated with water being used to put out the fire. But then he demonstrated that, in fact, they come from a totally different way of folding the shroud, a totally different pattern. And I just thought, but nobody saw that before him. People have been studying this for 30 years, and nobody noticed, although it was there in front of them, that the water stain patterns don't match the burns, and therefore must have arrived at a different time. Fascinating. And I thought, well, I'm sure if I look at the shroud for long enough, I'll discover something like that.
I think Barry told me it was from the fire, the water stains.
There are little fires. Another of my amazing pictures coming up. If we've got the water stains which go like this, and we've got those great big shapes, yeah? Those, and there are some water stains here which are associated with the burn holes. And it's very easy to fold the shroud up in such a way that you can get a pin and stick it right through all the burn holes, showing that that's how they all matched on top of each other. But the water stains, which are sort of here, if you fold the shroud up, you can't make those match each other at all. They come from a complete, and there's a bit more. They go here as well. They come from a completely different folding pattern. Aldo Guareschi, his papers, the 2 papers, and they're both on shroud.com, like everything is. Well worth looking up.
Isn't there also like a jar theory, that it was folded up in a jar?
Yes. If for the fire, I'm going to have to do this, aren't I? Here's a shroud. Hold steady. Have you got time? I mean, you can see I'm the sort of person. be here till way past your lunchtime, or indeed past your dinner time if you let me. Here is a shroud. Now, I'm going to fold it in half lengthways. Then I'm going to fold it in half lengthways again. I'm doing this a bit roughly, but never mind. So that's 4 layers thick. Now I'm going to fold it in half that way and then that way. So I've now got it folded nicely like that, and it's actually folded under one more time, but I'm not going to bother with that. And I'm going to stick this into a into a metal box, and the metal box is going to melt, and then it's going to pour a hole right through. Now I might not have folded it up exactly right, but I am going to make a hole in it. So the stuff just off camera, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to use my teeth. Right. Here we go. And now I'm going to unfold it. Can you see that against the white? Wait, yeah, you can probably see it okay. Can you see? Hold it back a bit. Oh, against me. Can you see the holes? Yeah, very much like the shroud. So that's how we know how the shroud was folded for the fire. However, for the water stains, where was it? I threw a piece of paper away and I've lost it. Gone off. Wait a minute. Here it is. For the water stains, we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to fold it in half, as before, and in half again. But this time, oops. All right, so we've got the same thin thing as we had before. But this time we're going to fold it like this, in a zigzag pattern, or fan fold as they call it. Yeah, like that. And we stuff this into something. It might be a box, cardboard box, wooden box, jar, container of some kind, which water gets into. Now, according to some theories, it's in the kind of jar that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in, which maybe cracks, maybe finds itself in a wet place, and a water stain starts to creep up. Whoops, I'm going on the right side. Get a pen. The water stain starts to creep up from this corner and soaks upwards into the cloth. And that's why when you undo that, you get this pattern, the red pattern, which is different from the burn pattern. Now, this could happen with the shroud in anything where a corner gets wet, but naturally, it could happen in the kind of jar which exactly matches the sort of jar that you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, there's no evidence that anybody used to store huge linen cloths in small porcelain jars. Mostly they stored them in boxes like anybody else. But if they did, then that would be one way of getting hold of that stain.
What are your thoughts on the serum halos around the blood?
They're very interesting, but there's all sorts of different things about them. Firstly, I don't think they've been characterized enough for us to be sure what they are. Again, this would be part of the 100,000, the 900,000 pounds that I'm prepared to pass on to the Archbishopric of Turin so that I could look at the shroud and see what it is. Some people have done some interesting, in fact, Kelly probably has done some interesting work on anticoagulants. One of the problems with painting in blood is that it tends to thicken up really quickly. it's quite astonishing because I've tried to do it. For a start, it's difficult enough to squeeze it out of your thumb. You put it on a paintbrush, and it goes very thick. So, and of course, it's got natural serum with it. But what you can do is mix it with an anticoagulant. And there are lots of possible anticoagulants. Somebody had the bright idea that, in fact, you squeezed the blood from a leech. After all, leeches were used medically throughout the Middle Ages to help with blood letting. In fact, they suck the blood out of you. And the way a leech manages to suck the blood out of a wound is that it injects an anticoagulant in so that the wound doesn't heal while it's sucking. So somebody had the idea that you could use a natural anticoagulant like a leech. Somebody else suggested that you could use something like lemon juice. So there are lots of clear and colorless liquids, which biological fluids as well, which can be used to help blood to stop it clotting. And any of those would quite possibly seep out faster than, would spread faster than the blood corpuscles themselves, or as some people have thought, that it all starts in the same place, and then the as it dries, the red corpuscles and the blood clot retracts. They call them blood retraction clots. And there's been a certain amount of work on that. But so whether those serum clots are all serum, partly serum, or not serum at all, I think is inconclusive at the moment. But I think the blood is blood, so there's no reason why it shouldn't be serum.
What's the most outrageous thing that you hear about the Shroud that just gets all your nerves when people talk about it?
I don't mind ignorance. I think what irritates me is most of all is people who've claimed to have studied the Shroud for 40 years and they say something that's completely wrong. Often because they misunderstand it, and sometimes just because they can't be bothered to find out the truth. And I think that's a pity. Anybody who tells me that the Shroud has been proved to be this or that irritates me quite a lot. When it hasn't. Yeah, no, there's a wonderful commentator. I mean, there's a handful of commentators who perhaps they haven't found you yet, but when they do, they'll write a lot in the comments. Who announced that anybody who thinks that the Shroud is medieval is a moron. You know, what's got into you? Weren't you born with the brains your mother gave you? And all that sort of stuff. And I just think it's terrific. I get a lot of abuse from mostly girls, mostly good Catholics. You can always tell. And then on the other hand, there are all the people who say, no, it was definitely denounced as a fraud by a medieval bishop, and therefore you're all, it must be medieval. And that's not right either. But anyway, that's all part of the entertainment.